Hi, I'm HP. Welcome to the Paper Trail. Before we get into the details of how today's subject tried to twist himself out of the jaws of justice, we have to understand the historical background of denazification. For the ordinary German, or rather for most Germans, the first few years after the war were a time of extreme uncertainty. People didn't know if or how Germany would continue to exist as a state, what punishments they could expect from the Allies, or what had happened to their relatives and friends. Just a few numbers to give you an idea of the situation that Germany was in. So about 30% of the total population was homeless, around 80% of the railway system was destroyed or unusable, 14 million refugees, roughly 20% of the pre-war population, had to be resettled. 14% of all Germans were prisoners of war, more than 7 million children were fully or half orphaned, and about 60% of school buildings were destroyed. The average daily ration in the American zone amounted to about 1,200 calories. The town where today's paper trail is leading us is Bamberg, a small university town in southern Germany. So I've got this pile of documents here, all from the post-war period, all from one person. I got these on the flea market a few years ago and they will lead us on today's trail. So I split this up into three parts. First, there are some newspapers that Georg B, the individual that you will get to know in this video, deemed worthy of keeping. Then there's some stuff about his military career, and the last pile right here is what is left of his post-war career, including his denazification. I would like to start off by just checking out this newspaper that he kept, because it offers us a really perfect insight into daily life in the American zone of post-war Germany. The first announcement that I want to show you is the one right here. Payment of current and overdue rent to the landlords of former concentration camp prisoners will take place from May 20th to May 22nd, 1946, between 8 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. each day at the new town hall. This is an issue that is often overlooked when looking at the post-war history of Germany. Those that had survived concentration camps were returning and had to be housed somehow. Making sure these people were distributed and housed properly while reimbursing their landlords was just one of the many challenges that the American military administration was facing. I already told you about how many people were homeless back then, so you can imagine what a monumental task that must have been, especially if you take the returning concentration camp inmates and the refugees from the eastern parts of the Reich into account. Then the second announcement is the one right here, and this refers to the economic state that Germany was in back then. Due to a new system being developed to ensure even distribution throughout Bavaria, ration cards for industrial businesses, craft workshops and healthcare consumers will no longer be issued by the economic offices. This notice highlights the severe supply shortages in post-war Germany. Authorities were trying to centralize and equalize distribution of even basic industrial goods. There is a similar one right here. According to the regulation of the State Office for Various Goods, dated April 3rd, 1946, agricultural and industrial baskets are now also subject to control system. Even such a basic thing as a basket for whatever purpose, for coal, potatoes or laundry, was controlled, and anyone needing these items had to present a ration certificate. And that really reflects the scarcity and the authorities' effort to regulate essential goods carefully. Then we can move on to another dimension, namely the judicial one. There is this public announcement right here. The Bamberg Military Court handed down sentences. Andreas Löhlein sentenced to 6 years in prison for theft of American property. Löhlein broke into a railway wagon and stole 50 cartons of cigarettes. Secondly, Johannes Kastermans sentenced to 5 years in prison for withholding information from Allied authorities, unlawful possession of American property, including American uniform pieces, falsely claiming to be a member of the Allied forces and presenting a forged curfew pass. And then, last but not least, you've got Franz Schumacher, who was sentenced to 5 years in prison for possession of a pistol. A lot of the crimes here certainly had something to do with the post-war economy, since it was mostly a black market economy. Owning 50 cartons of American cigarettes, which were used as a very common currency back then, might have catapulted Andreas Löhlein from poverty straight into the richest parts of Bamberg society. Nevertheless, you can tell how strictly the authorities enforced their new laws by just looking at the verdicts. While you could argue that property crimes and identity crimes, like the ones that I just talked about, should be punished severely, the next notice might be a bit more difficult to judge. On May 7, 1946, 6 young people were each sentenced to 3 months of hard labor for illegally crossing the border between the Russian and American occupation zones. After World War II, Germany, as most of you might know, was divided into occupation zones, and movement between zones was strictly controlled. It didn't really matter if your motive was simple survival, work or family. People illegally crossing the border faced severe punishment. Just for a second, consider that just 5 years later, when the Cold War was in full swing, West Germany and the American authorities actually did the exact opposite and encouraged migration from the GDR into West Germany. Keeping that in mind, do you find these verdicts justified? Let me know in the comments. So how did denazification work? After the war, Germany was split up into 4 zones of occupation. In March 1946, the authorities in the US zone adopted the law for the liberation from National Socialism and militarism, commonly known as the Liberation Law, and this effectively marked the point at which the process of denazification was at least partially transferred into German hands. So the Americans were the most eager to implement this process, partly because they could approach it without the burdens of their own recent past. So many French had collaborated with the Nazi regime, the British were struggling with the first cracks in their now crumbling empire, and the Soviets did not really care much for questionnaires. If you were found to be a Nazi in the Eastern Zone, it usually meant expropriation, a one-way ticket to Siberia, or execution. Anyway, back to how this worked. If you were 18 years or older, you had to pick up a questionnaire for a fee of 20 pfennig. It consisted of 131 questions which had to be answered truthfully. You also had to confirm receipt of the questionnaire and return it by a specific date. If you lied or if you didn't cooperate, your food ration cards or work permit were revoked, and this was basically a death sentence in those days. I'll make another video on this questionnaire where I read out all of the questions. You can check that out on my channel. Once completed, the questionnaire was then sent to a Spruchkammer, a denazification tribunal. Each was headed by a fully qualified lawyer, assisted by a public prosecutor with a clean political record, and by lay assessors who were politically untainted and familiar with local circumstances. The public prosecutor examined the questionnaires and assigned each person to one of the 5 categories established by the Allied Control Council. The Spruchkammer then determined, based on what was essentially a 5-level Nazi scale, whether the individual was a major offender, an offender, a lesser offender, a follower, or an exonerated person, meaning not subject to legal sanctions. Depending on how high the Spruchkammer judged your Nazi level, you could expect punishments ranging from fines for the lower levels to forced labor, occupational bans, internment or imprisonment for the higher-ups. Appeals could be made against the classification and its accompanying penalties. So any sane German at the time who had anything to lose pursued one or more of the following strategies. A. Get as many friends, neighbors or relatives as witnesses to testify that you had opposed the party from day one and only joined under pressure. B. Paint yourself in the best possible light by overemphasizing any moments of non-conformity. C. Downplay accusations that couldn't be denied, for example if you had been in the SS. And D. In later years, delay the process as long as possible, since the longer denazification dragged on, the milder the verdicts tended to be. So here we are, meet Georg B from Bamberg in Franconia, southern Germany. So let's start off with his military service. You can see we've got a couple of documents here. Keep in mind that he was born in 1900. So the first thing that we've got here is this, and that's basically a notification telling him that he is assigned to Landwehr I and is placed under the military supervision of the local military registration office, the Wehrmeldeamt in German. So that's dated June 15th, 1936. It shows you how early and thoroughly Nazi Germany organized military control over adult men, even before the war began. Keep in mind that he was merely assigned to Landwehr I, which is basically an older reserve formation, typically men who had already completed military service or were beyond prime frontline age. In case of mobilization, Landwehr units were used for rear area security or occupation, and only later in the war they increasingly were sent to the front as manpower shortages grew. So the mention of the Wehrmeldeamt here shows how closely civilian life and military oversight were interconnected. So even in peacetime, the state knew where he lived, what he did, and when he could be summoned. The second document that we've got here is this summons. So in your capacity as a person liable for military service in the Beurlaubtenstand, so reserve status, you are hereby instructed to report to the police registration authority responsible for you for the creation of your Wehrstammblatt. You can see he had to do this until February 19th, 1937, during official office hours, typically German. And this document clearly illustrates the bureaucratic machinery behind German rearmament, especially in the years before the war. So the Wehrstammblatt was basically the core personal file of every man liable for military service. So it contained personal data, profession and education, and so on. And turning up there obviously was not a request in the modern sense, but a legal obligation. Failing to appear could result in fines or criminal penalties. So this document also shows you that 2 years before the outbreak of the war, the regime was already finalizing the personal military files of millions of men. On paper, the war had already begun long before the first shots were fired. Then you've got the third document right here from January 25th, 1939. This basically tells him that he has been released from direct military supervision, from the Wehrüberwachung, and in the future he was no longer required to report to the military replacement offices. Instead, he only had to register and deregister with the civilian police registration authorities. So at first glance, this document appears to signal relief, so a withdrawal from active military oversight. Keep in mind, in early 1939, this was not a sign of safety. Germany was already fully mobilizing its military, and being released from the Wehrüberwachung usually meant that he was either temporarily or permanently unavailable for immediate call-up, or his age or health placed him outside of priority categories. But crucially, this did not mean exemption from future service. For now, he was no longer actively tracked, so once the war broke out, many men found themselves pulled back into the system. So this document is not really a relief, it's a brief pause and not an escape. So then we've got document number 4 here. So that's a call-up for medical examination for the Musterung. So on basis of the military service law, all men liable for military service born in the years 1900 to 1903 were hereby called up for military examination. He had to report for the medical examination on Monday, July 8th, 1940 at 6:45 a.m., punctually at the Holzhof barracks. This document essentially marks the moment when bureaucracy turned into inevitability. By July 1940, Germany had already invaded Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium and France, and the war with the Soviet Union was basically looming on the horizon. The age groups listed here were no longer young recruits. Most of them had families and established their civilian lives. So calling them up shows how quickly the demand for manpower was to rise once Operation Barbarossa began. Notably, this comes after earlier documents suggested reduced military oversight. And that's a key reality of the system here. So no status was permanent. When the war demanded it, the files were reopened. Okay, so on to document number 5. So this is a summons. You are hereby instructed to report on April 8th, 1943 at 7:30 a.m. to the Musterungsstaat Bamberg for re-examination. Re-examination in 1943 tells us a great deal even without knowing the medical result. So by April 1943, a mere 2 months after Stalingrad, Germany was facing a severe manpower crisis. And the re-examination basically meant that the state was asking that one blunt question again: can we use him now? Men who had once been classified as too old or medically unfit or suitable only for limited duties were now reassessed under lower standards. And that's basically the point of time that Germany really started scraping the bottom of the barrel. So this document marks the point where earlier classifications no longer protected a man. We don't know the result of that re-examination, but it wasn't his last one, because then yet again, February 22nd, 1944, at 7:50 a.m. he had to turn up at the Wehrmeldeamt Bamberg for his second re-examination. So by February 1944, I'm sure all of you are aware of that, Germany was clearly fighting a losing war on multiple fronts. So the Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure. In the West, the Allies were preparing what would soon become D-Day. And Germany's manpower reserves were nearly exhausted. At this stage, medical standards had been drastically lowered, and men previously rejected, deferred, or classified for limited service were now reconsidered. This then is also the last document that we have concerning his military career. So apparently, yet again in 1944, Georg was lucky and did not get drafted. Just imagine for a second what an emotional roller coaster this must have been. So slowly realizing that your nation is fighting a losing war, and time again facing the prospect of being thrown into that war. Others certainly weren't as fortunate as him. So for example, in January 1945, just a mere 4 months before the end of the war, 155 elderly Bamberg citizens received their conscription orders, and then they were sent to the Eastern Front as part of a Volkssturm unit. Zahneisen, the mayor of Bamberg, who you certainly remember from the start of this video, held a speech, basically a goodbye speech, which he was later heavily criticized for, saying, "You must defend the border with your bodies, and we will share the bread with your wives. The traitors among you we will punish." After that speech, and after hours of waiting and another long stop in Bayreuth, the cattle cars carried the men eastward, packed with only what they had brought with them from home, without blankets or rations. So many of these people only wore tropical shoes. All of them were poorly equipped, none had weapons, and there was even a man with a walking disability who had been drafted. So the train reached the area near Frankfurt an der Oder, which at the time bore the brunt of the Soviet offensive, and thrust into the chaos, the Bamberg Volkssturmmen were swept away by the Russian assault divisions. So by the time the war was over, only 40 to 50 returned in drips and drabs. Over 100 were missing, having been killed or died in captivity. So Georg surely would have heard of these events, and he sure as hell was happy enough to not end up as a stiff frozen body somewhere on the Eastern Front. Another thing that's quite remarkable about Georg is that he didn't serve in either of the two world wars. He might have been drafted towards the end of the First World War when he was around 17 or 18 years old, but there are no documents that would confirm that. And then he also miraculously managed to not get drafted into the army into the Second World War. There are very few careers like this. If he had been born 5 years earlier or 5 years later, he surely would have seen action in any of these two wars. What do you think? Did he have friends in high places, or was he just so good at his job that he seemed more important to the Reich in civil rather than in military service? We can now move on to our second pile of documents right here. These are all the documents that have something to do with his denazification. There's his questionnaire right here, which is by far the most important document we have left. You can fold it out all the way, and it's a really long and detailed document. For those of you that haven't yet checked it out. You can find another video about the questionnaire on my channel. So if you wonder what all the questions are about, check that out. In this video right here, I'm only gonna go into the relevant part of his questionnaire, not the whole document. I'm going to point out anything that might have compromised Georg, so let's get started. This is the first page of the document. At the top right here, you can find a set of guidelines explaining how the form had to be filled out. Then the first section here contains basic personal information, so name, date of birth, address, and so on. There's nothing particularly interesting or compromising here. Georg B was born in 1900, was a German citizen, he was of Roman Catholic confession, and had an appendectomy scar. So if you wonder about that, yes, they even went into that level of detail. Next comes his education. He finished Realschule in 1917. Realschule was a middle academic track, you could say, more demanding than Volksschule, but below the gymnasium, which led to university. Then we can move on to his professional career. He started working in the city administration of Bamberg in 1930 at the age of 30. Unfortunately, I couldn't find anything about what he did during the turbulent early years of the Weimar Republic. Remember, in 1917 he finished school, and then there's a noticeable gap of 13 years here, but unfortunately with the documents we have here, we will not be able to answer that question. What is interesting though is that the Nazi takeover in 1933 did not change anything about his employment. So for him, business went on as usual, and that's another quite funny thing I find. Nothing changed after the Americans took Bamberg on April 14th, 1945 either. You can see here that he simply writes that from April 16th onward, he continued working in the same place, just under a different superior. His former boss Zahneisen, who you might remember from the start of this video, was replaced by Wegmann, the former mayor of Bamberg. One final noteworthy detail appears here at the bottom. He claims he was deferred from military service because of his administrative duties. That also explains why he managed to avoid being drafted several times during the war. Now, we move on to section E, membership in party organizations, and this is where things get interesting. First, we see that he joined the Nazi Party in May 1937. He also mentions this in his personal statement, which I'll show you in the next chapter. Right here, he is asked whether he was a member of the SS, and he answers that with a no, and then adds in brackets that he was only a supporting member of the SS from 1934 to 1939. So not a real member, only a supporter. You can make of that what you want. Further down, there are a few more memberships listed. He joined the Reichsbund der Deutschen Beamten, so the Reich Association of German Civil Servants. That was pretty standard for civil servants, not unusual at all. Then in 1935 he became a member of the Nationalsozialistische Volkswohlfahrt, remaining there until 1945. The Volkswohlfahrt was the Nazi Party's welfare organization. It provided aid to racially acceptable Germans, and yet again this was quite common. Below that there's entry number 92. In 1938 he joined the Reichsluftschutzbund, the Reich Air Protection League, a Nazi mass organization that trained civilians in air raid precautions and civil defense. And the timing right here isn't a coincidence either. So by 1938 war was clearly looming and the regime was actively preparing the civilian population. The last organization listed here is the Reichskolonialbund, the Reich Colonial League, which promoted Germany's claims to lost overseas colonies which they had lost after the First World War. In practice, this organization had little to no real importance. Many leading Nazis considered overseas colonies as a waste of time, preferring territorial expansion in Eastern Europe under the concept of Lebensraum. That's another membership that I would not consider particularly compromising. Further down, there's a few more questions about his party allegiance before 1933. He claims he was a member of the Bavarian People's Party and voted for them in 1932 and in 1933. And aside from that, there's nothing really remarkable here. In section F, he states that he did not belong to any other organizations. In section G, he shows that he neither published writings nor gave speeches. Section H is about income. His annual salary rose from 2,600 Reichsmark in 1931 to 4,700 Reichsmark in 1945. To put that into perspective, 4,500 Reichsmark in the mid-1940s would roughly correspond to around $45,000 to $50,000 today. So that's a solid middle-class income in Germany at the time. Something that stands out is how sharply his salary increased after 1939. I can't say for certain why, but it may be connected to his party membership and his ability to present himself as a loyal and reliable civil servant, but that's nothing I could confirm. I'm not entirely sure about that. Maybe it was also because he had already served for a certain amount of time and was promoted. Then, finally, in section I, he states that he never traveled abroad. He spoke English and French, and that's pretty much about it. At the very bottom, under remarks, he adds that he would like to clarify his answers to question 41 and 42. And these are the ones concerning his party membership and his SS membership. And that clarification comes in the form of the next document. The second, and probably the more telling document that we have here, is his personal justification statement. So it's a total of 3 pages, and usually this was added to the questionnaire when you handed it in. You can see that he prepared this in advance when you look at the gaps he left for the date and the verdict. And in my view, this suggests that he wrote this before he even started the process, probably to prepare himself in case he lost his job by being judged a high-level Nazi. Then, secondly, the paper is very poor quality, and this is hardly something that he would have handed in that stage. And the last bit that stands out are the corrections he made. So remember, we're still in the typewriter age here, so all the changes are still clearly visible. You've got them here and, for example, over here. And there are several places where he altered his wording, and none of these changes seem coincidental. So I'll go into these in more detail when we analyze the document further. So here we go.
The Spruchkammer has classified me in category by decision of. In response, I submit the following justification. I have never been a National Socialist. Former Lord Mayor Zahneisen, who was also the Kreisleiter of Bamberg, left no means untried to pressure every last civil servant in the city administration into joining the NSDAP.
Well, that's the first point where I have to remark a few things. So Zahneisen, the guy he mentions here, was indeed the former mayor of Bamberg, and he had also been the superior of Georg B. There's a lot to be said about Zahneisen. Just like most high-ranking party members, he had fought in World War I, then he joined the party in the early 1920s, and from that point of time on, he firmly believed in the ideas of National Socialism. The most remarkable thing about Zahneisen, who was once called a splendid guy by Joseph Goebbels himself, is what he said after his denazification process. So his reaction to his denazification trial, where he was judged to be a follower, which obviously would have been a ridiculously mild verdict, was a protest, and he said the following, and I quote, "It would be the worst thing that could happen to me if a contemporary court were to brand me as a follower. I became a National Socialist and, as such, fought for the idea and contributed significantly to the attainment of power." Quote end. Well, I guess there's not much more to be added here. Personally speaking, I have no doubts whatsoever that what George writes here is true, and that Zahneisen used his position of power to pressure his subordinates into joining the party. Anyway, back to the text.
Because of my religious upbringing and my inner rejection of the National Socialist worldview, I was opposed to joining the party. After the First World War, as a young man, I joined the Bavarian People's Party. I was a founding member of the Jungbayernbund, the youth group of the Bavarian People's Party, and remained an active member until mid-1933. I have maintained this political conviction internally ever since.
You will see this idea of inner rejection several more times, so this is a very common pattern in documents like this. So here he tries to make use of his Bavarian separatist identity. Bavaria has always been and will probably always be the most independently minded German state. And this particular mentality, combined with a rural, conservative Catholic population, meant that the BVP, the Bavarian People's Party, was less likely to lose voters to the NSDAP. So what Georg is doing here is emphasizing that he wasn't one of the early Nazi supporters, but instead belonged to the traditional BVP. Now, on to the changes that he made. So the first one right here is probably just a spelling correction, but the second one here is more revealing. So he crossed out conviction and replaced it with political conviction. So clearly trying to present himself as politically innocent. Then you got the next one right here, where he corrected the way that he wrote how he joined the Jungbayernbund. And that's an attempt to emphasize that he didn't just enter that organization. He was so convinced of their views that he even became one of their founding members.
I am also a professing Catholic, and despite open hostility toward the Church, I have always remained loyal to it, especially since 1933, when that was no easy thing to do. I demonstrated this publicly by regularly attending church services and processions. It was no secret that, especially here in Bamberg, surveillance of so-called blacks, meaning Catholics, was particularly strict. Despite all that, I have always remained true to myself. I've never abandoned my political beliefs, the Bavarian People's Party, nor my unwavering loyalty to my faith.
So just like in the previous passage, you can again see this emphasis on his Catholic identity. So he tries to frame his regular church attendance as a kind of passive resistance, you could say. And this is another theme that appears throughout the rest of this manuscript, so watch out for it. Then there's another interesting change here. So the first correction that he did was crossing out the word fanatic, and that clearly makes sense. I mean, fanatic was probably not the ideal adjective to describe yourself as a German in the immediate post-war period, so that's why he crossed it out. It's quite clear. And the second one that you got right here is a bit trickier. So he removed that line here where he's lamenting how difficult life supposedly became after the Nazis seized power. And my guess is that he deleted it to avoid overdoing things. So Georg knew he had been a small cog in the machine, but he had been a part of the machine nonetheless. And he may have feared that such a complaint would come across as hypocritical. And then finally he crosses out publicly and fearlessly here, which I consider as the same thing as above. He knows he's not the white knight in shining armor, and that's why he doesn't even pretend that he was.
When, at the end of 1937, civil servants were told that anyone unworthy of party membership was also unworthy of being a public official, I registered for membership in the NSDAP for the sake of my family and my position.
I couldn't find any information about his family, so I don't know whether he had children, but it would have been unusual if he didn't. And it's likely that some of his descendants are still alive today. So when it comes to the statement, you can interpret that however you want, but try for a moment, just for a moment, to put yourself in his position. Imagine you've got a family to feed, imagine you've got several children to feed, and then your superior pressures you to join the party, and you're facing the very real possibility of losing your job if you don't. So what would you have done? Would you have resisted, or would you have done the same as Georg did? So keep that question in mind as we move on to the next part.
Under similar pressure, I accepted a post as Blockhelfer, block assistant, in early 1938, after being assured that my only duty would be collecting membership fees. I carried out this task reluctantly and with irritation. I've never engaged in propaganda activities, and I destroyed any promotional materials I received. Despite my formal membership, I resisted National Socialism to the best of my ability. A long illness in 1942 finally gave me the opportunity to resign from this unwanted position. In March 1942, I gave up my duties and refused further cooperation. As a result, I incurred the hostility of the local group leader, who publicly denounced me as a traitor during a meeting. Afterwards, I was observed. Because I did not wear the party badge, I was repeatedly ordered to do so, but, out of inner conviction, I refused.
So we have now come to my favorite part of this testimony, and I really like the wording that is being used at the very start of this paragraph, and that wording is clearly mitigating his own culpability. So according to him, his party membership had been nothing but a formality, something he never believed in, and he also resisted, but to the best of his ability. And this, again, is a familiar pattern in these post-war testimonies. So Georg here tries to paint himself as the reluctant member, the silent dissenter, the man who insisted he was, well, more victim than participant. And you can form your own opinion about whether that's true or not, but there is another quite telling correction here where he inserted the word endlich, so in English that's finally, and that's just him trying to show how much he hated working for the party.
In autumn 1944, the block leader, Ludwig Böhm of the Bamberg East local group, filed a written request for my expulsion from the party, stating that I refused to wear the badge, would not say Heil Hitler, and greet people instead with Grüß Gott.
Just a quick note for those of you who are not familiar with the German language. So Grüß Gott is a greeting mainly used in southern Germany, especially in Catholic areas, because it carries a very strong religious undertone. So translating it is quite tricky, but the closest literal version of it would be God greet you. And using this instead of the official Nazi greeting would be seen as some subtle symbolic act of resistance. That said, in Bamberg, which then as now was the seat of a bishop, it might have simply been considered normal. And another interesting point here is how suddenly, so halfway into his testimony, he casts himself as the victim in his story. He doesn't go into detail about whether his written request to be expelled from the party actually worked out, but there's no way for us to find out now whether that's true or not. So anyway, let's return to the text.
I've also never taken part in the persecution of Jews. On the contrary, since 1925, I did business with Jewish salesmen such as Joelson, Nuremberg, Lechziner, Berlin, and Herschtal, Bamberg, who had visited my parents while traveling. When persecution intensified in 1933, Herschtal repeatedly came to my home, seeking my help and advice.
So we're now coming to the more tragic part of this text. So, well, I'm sure you just listened, and it's quite striking to see how he frames this supposed act of resistance. So he claims people came to him for help, but we can't really confirm whether he actually helped anyone. And by that time, it was already incredibly difficult to assist anyone persecuted by the National Socialists, contrary to the early days of the regime. So, for instance, in 1933, the party ordered boycotts of Jewish businesses, and internationally this drew sharp criticism, particularly from the United States. But also within Germany, a notable number of citizens still felt some solidarity with their Jewish neighbors. So that, well, boycott was quickly ended. But after 5 years of propaganda and scapegoating, reality in Germany had changed drastically. So I did a bit of research myself, and I tried tracing the names he mentioned in his testimony. And I was able to find one of them, namely the guy from Bamberg. So his full name was Baruch Herschtal, and he was a Polish citizen, as Georg B notes. So Baruch and his wife Jette moved from Neustadt, which is nowadays in Poland, to Bamberg in 1914. And from then until 1938, when Jews were banned from trading, they ran a white goods business, selling their wares at fairs and markets. So on February 17, 1936, the Bamberg Registration Office followed warnings from the government of Upper Franconia about supposed Polish Secret Service activity, and then they created a list of Poles living in the city, and this list included Baruch and his family. In October 1938, then, the Herstals were deported to the Polish border because of their citizenship, but then they were sent back to Bamberg shortly afterwards. And on September the 8th, 1939, so just a week after the war began, Baruch was arrested and held in Bamberg prison. Later, he was transferred to Sachsenhausen concentration camp in 1940 and then to Dachau in September 1940, and that's where he died in 1941. So his wife passed away on May 20th, 1940 in the Jewish hospital in Fürth. Their daughter, Clara, who was born in 1915, even managed to escape, fleeing to the United States in July 1938, so before things got really bad. So she shows up in the 1940 US Census, living in Philadelphia with her cousin, who had come from Austria with his family. So while Clara survived, her parents tragically did not. So unfortunately, I couldn't find any information about the circumstances of their death, so neither for Jette nor for Baruch, but for Baruch I would assume that it had something to do with the treatment of Jews in, German concentration camps. And we cannot hold Georg personally responsible for this tragedy. I mean, it's quite clear that any advice he might have offered was of limited help considering the outcome, and conveniently for him, the only person who could have confirmed his story had already died by the end of the war. But then again, we don't even know whether B was aware of that by the time he wrote the statement. For the other two names, information is sparse, so I managed to find several people deported from Berlin named Leszczyna, but without any more details, so it's impossible to tell which of the five men, Wilhelm, Fritz, Arnim, Max or Manfred, he was talking about. I also couldn't find anything on a Joelsson family from Nuremberg. The surname is quite common, and for example, there was a Joelsson family in Gunzenhausen near Nuremberg, but I can't really confirm whether this is the same family that he mentioned. Last but not least, you've got some changes here. So the very first one here is a bit tricky because of German grammar, basically. So translating this is so tricky because sentence structure is so differently. I don't want to go too much into the details, but what stands out is that he crossed out the words mich and mir, and both would translate as me in English, but one is direct and the other is indirect. So basically this means that it seems that he first tried to frame these visits that he's talking about as centered on himself and not on his parents. And he may have been tempted to make more of that connection than it really was, but he stepped back from it, and he was likely realizing that overstating that would make him look dishonest and damage his credibility.
In conclusion, I wish to emphasize that I never gained any personal, professional, or financial advantage from party membership. I never owned any party uniform, never attended a party rally, never voluntarily joined any meetings, and never read party literature due to lack of interest.
If you look at his career, which you can see in this Denazification questionnaire, it wasn't particularly remarkable, and like many others at the time, he didn't really read much of the party literature. That said, most of the claims that he makes here would have been difficult to verify after the war, making it hard to judge the accuracy of what he wrote.
My wife, who never concealed her opposition and was not active in any organization, was, on the orders of the Women's League, Forced to work as a laborer in an armaments factory from September 1943 to January 1945, the only woman in our block to do so. There, with my knowledge and despite strict prohibitions, she regularly helped the Eastern forced laborers by secretly leaving food and drink for them at agreed-upon spots in the factory.
So yeah, this text is meant to be about him and not his wife, but it's certainly convenient for him to include her here. Unfortunately, there are no further details about which factory his wife worked at. There were several factories there, many of which also produced goods important for the war effort, and some of them also had forced laborers working there. The more telling thing here is actually the change that he made. So first he added in this passage where he mentioned that he knew about his wife's efforts, which makes him look like an accomplice to resistance. And then there is a second change here where he tries to portray what his wife did as some sort of secret mission. So by framing it that way, he emphasized the danger she exposed herself to in order to do the right thing, and he was part of what she did.
Given my consistent rejection of the National Socialist ideology, I was only a nominal member of the NSDAP. I resisted to the best of my ability, and I therefore asked to be placed in the category of exonerated persons.
Okay, so that's a lot to take in, but there are also some things that he didn't write. So if we go back to his Denazification questionnaire, we can see that he mentioned that he was in the SS as a supporting member. So that was not a real kind of membership, but rather a way to support the SS without actually becoming part of it. Keep in mind, this is still the early version of the SS, not the almost economic empire with its own army that it became later during the war. So in 1933, the SS had roughly 13,000 supporting members, but at the end of 1933, so shortly after the Nazis had seized power, there was a total of 167,272 supporting members, so more than 10 times of what it was before the takeover. There were usually three possible reasons why people did that. So first of all, it was about prestige. So after the Sturmabteilung, the SR was purged by the SS in 1934. The SS positioned itself to be an elite circle of people, and joining offered an opportunity to position yourself in favor of the cause without actually joining it. Then secondly, it was about career. So in certain professions, especially among civil servants, business owners, and doctors, becoming a supporting member of the SS could be beneficial for your career because it was a signal for political reliability and loyalty to the regime. Third, it was about social pressure. Think back to what you heard about his superior before. Especially in smaller communities or professional circles, not being a supporting member could attract unwanted attention or suspicion. So he might have joined because of that as well. So Georg became a member in 1934, after the Nazis seized power, as he mentioned in his questionnaire, and in the same year he joined the Reichsbund der deutschen Beamten, which was basically the trade union for German civil servants in the German Reich. And from my point of view, he probably made that decision based on the assumption that he could climb up further the ladder, now that Germany was, well, essentially under new management. But both of the other factors might have played a role as well, but with a few things that we have left here, it's probably impossible for us to tell what went through his mind when he made that decision.
So what became of Georg? His denazification trial must have taken place sometime in 1946, and the sources don't really tell us what verdict he received. However, we do have the record granting him permission to re-enter his service at the town administration. It's signed by a member of the American military administration. And this strongly suggests that he was classified no higher than Mitläufer, so a follower, and that his efforts to portray himself in a certain light were
quite effective. We cannot know exactly what he felt at that stage, so many in his position were likely relieved to be able to continue providing for their families in post-war Germany amidst food shortages and widespread destruction. So think back to the circumstances that I mentioned at the start of this video. It's possible that, like others, he felt some measure of relief at being able to feed his wife and children again. So that's the historical context for Georg's situation, but how does that make you feel? So was this outcome deserved? Were you surprised by it? Share your thoughts in the comments, please. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you make of this case. You've reached the end of this paper trail, but many more await. Thanks for following along. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss the next trail.